Snow fell as though the sky itself had grown weary of holding it. The wind carried it sideways, sharp and bitter, rattling against the shutters of a small cabin crouched low against the storm. Lantern light flickered from within, a trembling glow swallowed by the white chaos. Inside, the air was thick with wood smoke and silence. She sat near the hearth, her hands mending a worn coat with slow stitches, the fire snapping like an old friend murmuring to itself. The world outside pressed close against the walls. Every gust howled like a wounded animal, clawing at the seams of her shelter. She had learned to live with such nights, with the loneliness that came with them. Once, not long ago, she had been a woman of the town, standing in church pews, trading smiles at the mercantile, passing baskets of bread between neighborly hands. But time and people had a way of turning soft moments into sharp stones. Her husband had gone, whether to war or to drink or to another woman. No one cared enough to say kindly. The town whispered that she was too proud, too stubborn, too different. They left her to the edges of their circle, and she chose the wilderness over their scorn. The cabin was her fortress now. She chopped her own wood, traded hides and herbs for salt and flour, milked her goat each morning, even in the biting frost. She had taught herself the rhythm of solitude. The only voices she heard were the wind, the fire, and her own when she grew too starved for sound and spoke aloud simply to feel less ghost-like. That night, when the blizzard rose to its full fury, she pulled on her coat and stepped into the storm to check the animals. The cold was a living thing, biting her cheeks, stinging her eyes with needles of ice. She leaned into the gale, half blind, half stubborn, the snow swallowing her footprints as soon as she made them. The barn creaked under its blanket of white, the mule shifting restlessly within. She soothed it with a gentle hand, pulled the door tight, and turned back toward the cabin. That was when she heard it. At first she thought it was the storm playing tricks, some strange pitch of the wind that made her heart stumble. But it came again, thin, broken, desperate. A cry. Not the howl of coyote, not the groan of timber, but a sound too fragile to belong anywhere in this wilderness. Her pulse thundered. She turned, squinting into the blur of snow. The cry rose again, weaker now, as if the storm itself tried to bury it. She moved toward it, her boots sinking deep, her breath burning her lungs. Her hands shook as she brushed snow aside, following the faint wail until she came upon a drift, heaped unnaturally high. Something lay beneath. She fell to her knees, clawing at the snow with bare hands until they burned raw. Beneath the white crust a small bundle emerged, hide wrapped stiff with frost, a face barely visible. She gasped, lifting it free. A baby, skin dusky, lips blue with cold, eyes fluttering half shut. A Comanche child. For a moment she froze, every tale she'd ever heard of raids and bloodshed rising in her mind. To take the child would mean danger. To leave it meant certain death. The storm shrieked around her as if demanding her choice. She pressed the bundle against her chest, wrapping her coat tight around it. She whispered into the storm, voice trembling, words spilling out more like prayer than speech. Hush now. I've got you. You'll not be lost to this night. Back inside, the cabin felt suddenly too small for the weight of what she carried. She stoked the fire high, stripped the frozen hides away, wrapped the child in quilts softer than her own skin. The baby whimpered weakly, searching for warmth. She warmed goat's milk by the fire, dipped her finger, and coaxed it into the tiny mouth. The child sucked greedily, a spark returning where frost had nearly stolen life. She rocked the bundle in her arms, her heart beating louder than the wind. Fear whispered at her edges. What if the warriors came searching? What if the town learned what she had hidden here? Yet when the baby's hand found her finger and held it with surprising strength, those fears softened. Outside, the storm howled on, erasing every trace of what had been left in the snow. Inside, by the glow of the fire, she held the child close. Alone no longer. Unknowing of the storm she had just welcomed into her life, a storm not of wind or ice, but of men, of blood, of history that waited beyond the horizon. And yet in that moment, all that mattered was the fragile breath against her skin, the quiet promise she made to the child without speaking a word. The storm passed as all storms do, leaving behind a world muffled in white silence. The prairie stretched wide and endless beneath the pale sun, its edges blurred with frost. Days turned to weeks, and she found herself no longer walking that path of solitude alone. The baby filled the cabin with new sounds, small cries, soft breaths, the occasional bubbling laugh that surprised her like a bird song in winter. She carried the child everywhere, close to her chest, bundled against the lingering cold. Out on the prairie, she would hum wordless tunes, letting her voice drift over the grasses, a lullaby that belonged to no language, yet seemed to calm the child all the same. She found herself speaking more, telling stories aloud as though the baby understood, recounting memories of her mother's cooking fires, the smell of bread rising, the sound of her father's boots against the porch. Loneliness, once a weight that pressed against her ribs, softened into something gentler. At night, when the baby stirred, she would rise from her bed, cradle the tiny body against her shoulder, and pace the length of the cabin. The floor creaked beneath her steps. The fire's glow painted her shadow across the walls. She would press her cheek against the child's hair and whisper promises she did not fully understand. It had been years since she had spoken so tenderly to anyone, and the words surprised her as they left her lips. But life on the edge of the prairie was never left untouched by others. Her nearest neighbor, a man with a face weathered by more bitterness than sun, came by not long after the thaw began. He stood on her porch, shoulders hunched against the wind, eyes sharp as he glanced past her into the dim cabin. He spoke of Comanche raids, of settlers found with arrows in their sides. His voice dripped with warnings and half-veiled threats, his words carrying the weight of suspicion. He asked questions that did not need asking. Why she chopped more wood than before, why her lamp burned so late into the night. When she closed the door against him, she felt his stare linger like frost that refused to melt. Not all who came were cruel. The rancher who lived a mile south stopped by with a bundle of oats and jerky. He spoke little, his voice quiet, his manner steady. He noticed her tired eyes and offered to split her wood. She nearly refused out of habit, but something in the way he asked, without pity, without prying, made her nod. He did not linger long, nor did he press into her solitude. Yet when his eyes caught hers, there was no judgment in them, only a kind of understanding she had not expected. In town, the air buzzed with whispers. The widow at the mercantile let her words scatter like seeds on wind, telling anyone who would listen that the woman out on the edge of the prairie was strange, keeping secrets, perhaps touched by madness. People leaned in closer, eager for any tale that confirmed what they already thought, that a woman alone could not be right in her mind. When she walked through town with her shawl drawn tight, she felt their eyes upon her, and she knew the whispers trailed behind her steps like shadows. Fear wove itself into her days. She knew well what settlers thought of the Comanche, what punishment might come if they discovered the truth of the baby hidden in her arms. Yet each morning, when she woke to the child's dark eyes searching hers, she felt a kind of courage she had not known she still carried. She would not give the baby up, not to hunger, not to cold, not to the cruelty of men who could not see past their own fear. Still, she could not shake the unease that followed her. She heard coyotes at night, their cries carrying across the plain like questions she could not answer. Once, returning from a stream with a bucket of water, she felt eyes on her from the ridge above. She stood there, the baby against her chest, staring into the distance, but saw nothing more than the shimmer of heat and light. Even so, the feeling lingered. She was being watched. And so the days passed, heavy with both tenderness and dread. She rocked the baby to sleep each night, whispering words softer than the fire's crackle, and each morning she rose to face the wide, indifferent prairie. Yet deep within, she knew the silence was thinning, that something was gathering just beyond the horizon, waiting for the moment to break. The prairie woke slow beneath the touch of spring, the frost retreating into the shaded hollows while the grass lifted its first green blades. At dawn she stood in the doorway with the baby on her hip, the air cool and damp with mist, and she saw them, dark figures far across the horizon, riders moving like shadows stitched to the earth. They did not approach, only drifted along the ridge, silhouettes half swallowed by the light. Her breath caught, her arms tightening around the child. By the time she blinked, the riders had vanished into the folds of the land. In town, talk grew restless. Farmers spoke of stolen horses, of arrows found stuck into fence posts as warnings. A trader swore he had passed Comanche scouts moving like smoke through the valleys. She listened from the corner of the mercantile, her face lowered beneath her shawl, her heart pounding with a secret none of them could imagine. The gossiping widow leaned close to another woman, her voice sharp as a needle. "There is something odd about that one," she said. "Always has been. Too quiet, too proud. She keeps to herself too much, as though she has reason to hide." The words settled on her shoulders like stones as she slipped away, clutching her small parcel of flour tight. The cruel neighbor's visits became sharper, his questions barbed. He appeared one afternoon as she hung laundry on the line, his eyes narrowing as he studied the small garments that flapped in the wind. "Those are too small for you," he said, his mouth curling as though he had caught her in a lie. He spoke of loyalty to the town, of the dangers of savages, his tone carrying the kind of venom that hid fear beneath it. She met his stare without speaking, and when she turned her back, she felt his gaze linger heavy upon her. But the rancher came, too, and with him a different kind of silence. He arrived one evening with sacks of beans and cornmeal slung over his horse, his voice low when he said he thought she could use them. She tried to hide the child at first, but when the baby cried from inside, the truth spilled between them. She braced for judgment, for the sharp edge of the same fear she had seen in others. But he only stepped forward, placed the bundle of food at her feet, and looked at her with something steady and kind. His eyes softened when they found the child in her arms, and he said, "Sometimes the world leaves us with burdens that turn out to be blessings." She wanted to answer, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she nodded, and he left her with more warmth than the fire could give. The baby was no longer a bundle of fragile breath, but a spark of life that filled the cabin. She laughed when the woman dipped her fingers into water, gurgled when she crawled clumsy across the floorboards, clapped her hands at the light of dawn spilling across the window. Each sound filled the cabin with a kind of music that lifted the silence from its corners. In the child's resilience, she saw her own reflection, a life that had been pushed to the edges yet still refused to break. But the warning came all the same. A trader passing at dusk told her he had seen warriors moving not far from the river, their eyes set toward the northern plains. They were not raiding, not yet, but they were watching, always watching. His words settled like frost in her chest. That night she could not sleep. She sat by the fire with the child in her arms, staring at the door, certain that at any moment it would open not to wind, but to the shadows of men. The cruel neighbor returned again, his temper sharper than before. He spoke of what would happen if Comanche came, how no one would protect a woman who brought ruin to her own door. He leaned close, his voice dripping with accusation, saying the town would not bleed for her mistakes. His threats cut deeper than his words, and yet beneath them she heard it clearly. He was afraid. Fear always spoke loudest when it wore the mask of hate. That evening, when the sun melted into the edge of the land, she stepped outside with the baby held against her. The air was cool, the sky painted in fading fire. She looked across the prairie, and her breath stopped. There on the ridge, beneath the rising silver of the moon, stood a line of riders, silent, still, watching, their figures dark as cut stone against the pale glow of the night. The child stirred, pressing her small hand against her chest, as though sensing the weight of what approached. She held her tighter, her heart beating like a drum in the silence. The riders did not move closer, nor did they vanish. They only waited, shadows against the sky, a storm gathering without wind or thunder. She knew then that the time she had been dreading was no longer distant. It had come to her doorstep, silent and sure as the turning of the seasons. Dawn broke slow and heavy, a pale light spreading across the prairie, pressing against the mist that clung to the ground like a shroud. She stood in the doorway with the baby in her arms, her heart thundering as the earth itself began to tremble. From the far ridge they came, warriors cresting the horizon, one after another, until the land seemed filled with the thunder of hooves. Painted faces, dark braids streaming, lances tipped with feathers catching the morning light. 100 strong, their silence more fearsome than any war cry. The town had gathered at a distance, drawn by the sound. Men with rifles clutched tight, their wives whispering sharp prayers, children pressed against skirts. The cruel neighbor spat words like sparks, saying she had brought this doom, that she deserved whatever end awaited. He urged the others to hold their ground, but his eyes betrayed the tremor of a man already lost to fear. None stepped forward to stand with her. None but one. The rancher lingered apart from the rest, his face calm, his horse still beneath him. His gaze held steady, watching her cabin with the quiet resolve of a man who had already chosen his place in the story. The riders swept down from the ridge, surrounding her small cabin in a circle of restless horses. The air filled with the sound of snorting, stamping, the creak of leather, the rattle of beads and bone charms. The baby stirred, whimpered, and she held her tighter, pressing her lips to the child's dark hair. The doorframe seemed too thin to shield her, the ground too fragile to carry the weight of what stood before her. And yet she stepped outside. Barefoot, hair loose, face pale but unyielding, she walked into the circle of riders with the child in her arms. The chief dismounted slowly, his presence vast and steady, his eyes sharp as an eagle's. The feathers in his hair lifted with the breeze, the paint across his face stark against the pale dawn. He walked toward her, each step deliberate, the silence deepening until it seemed the whole prairie held its breath. She did not run. She did not plead. She only lifted the baby higher, as though the child itself were the only truth worth speaking. The chief stopped before her, his shadow falling long across the frost. His gaze shifted from her face to the bundle in her arms. The baby reached out with tiny fingers, as though recognizing what blood tied her to. A murmur moved through the riders, low and reverent, a sound like the rustle of wind through tall grass. For a heartbeat, she thought death had come, that her cabin would burn, her life end, her choice judged foolish by all who watched. But then the chief lowered himself to one knee. He held out his arms, and she placed the child into them with trembling hands. The baby quieted instantly, resting against his chest as though returning to a place remembered in blood. The chief looked up at her, his dark eyes filled with something deeper than words, gratitude, grief, and a kind of respect that crossed the distance between their worlds. He spoke softly in his own tongue, a rhythm of sound she did not understand, yet she felt its meaning all the same. He rose, cradling the child close, and for a long moment he simply regarded her. Then, slowly, he touched his hand to his chest, a gesture of honor, and turned to his people. They did not strike. They did not destroy. Instead, one by one, they bowed their heads as they passed her, a tide of riders flowing back across the prairie, leaving the cabin untouched, the woman standing in the pale light with her breath still trembling in her chest. The townsfolk scattered, muttering, their fear dissolving into silence. The cruel neighbor, his face pale, spat once into the dirt and left without looking back. Only the rancher remained, his horse stepping closer, his eyes fixed on her. He said nothing, but his presence spoke enough. He had seen her stand alone. He had seen her courage. She turned back to her cabin, the smoke rising from its chimney into the brightening sky. The land felt different beneath her feet, as though it too had witnessed the truth. She was no longer only the woman abandoned by whispers, no longer only the exile at the edge of town. She was the one who had carried a fragile life through the storm, the one who had stood unshaken when 100 warriors came to her door. She looked once more toward the horizon, where the riders had vanished into the morning light. In her chest stirred something she had not felt in years, a sense of belonging, not to a place or a people, but to the endless, untamed land itself. And as the fire warmed the cabin once more, a voice seemed to whisper through her, gentle as wind through the grass. Some storms come to break us, some to deliver us. Kindness given, even when it costs everything, carries further than fear, further than hate. Remember this. The heart that dares to protect what is fragile may one day find itself not surrounded by enemies, but by respect.